since it's just after 12 o'clock in the UK, that's probably the right thing to say. My name is Felix Schmid. I'm this year's chair of the Railway Division of the Institution of the IMechE. And I'm very delighted to be introducing Ewan Smith, who is the head of product management at Angel Train. Angel Train's one of the UK's leasing companies, which came out of British Railways many years ago. Ewan will talk to you about his work, and I'm very delighted because Ewan is one of my graduates from the University of Sheffield. He started the MSc program in Railway Systems Engineering in 2003. He graduated in 2006 or 7 from the University of Sheffield, and he has had a very significant career in railway engineering. So I think I'll just hand over to Ewan at this point. Oh, yes, can I just say, please put your questions into the question box, which appears if you press the back button on the top right-hand side, the arrow, and then you can enter your questions, and later on I will put them to Ewan.
Thank you, Felix. So, thanks, Felix, for that kind introduction. And thanks, I think, also to Ian Flynn for the invitation to speak to you today. It's a privilege to be here. And before I start, I'd just like to say a few words about the man whose name this lecture bears. George Ramshaw Curry, as many of you will know, was the 4th and longest serving Chief Executive of the Railway Industry Association. In his time at the helm of the organisation, he led the transition from Locomotive Manufacturers Association to the Railway Industry Association that we know today. On his retirement in 1985, he was made a companion of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, a rare distinction afforded to non-engineers who've made a significant contribution to mechanical engineering. As Felix noted, he and I have known each other for many years, our past first crossing on the MSc at Sheffield 17 years ago. I'd like to thank Felix for his work as chair of the Railway Division in such a challenging year. I'm sure it wasn't the year that he had planned at the start, but he and the team have done an excellent job of moving online and keeping such a full programme of events. Now, on the MSc, when Felix was lecturing, we used to try and see the slide count in his presentations, and our hearts would sink as we made the calculation. 150 slides, 1 hour lecture before lunch means 0 time for lunch, as the lecture's inevitably going to overrun. You'll be pleased to know I've only got 18 slides to get through today, so we should be finished around 12:40, leaving plenty of time for questions. So in the short time I have with you, I'm going to give you my take on some of the bigger challenges faced by the industry today and give you an owner's perspective on what we in the supply chain can do to help the industry to address these challenges. Before I launch into that, I'm going to give you just a little bit more background about myself and about Angel Trains, just to give you some context as to how I've come to be standing, or virtually standing, in front of you today. So I started my railway career almost 30 years ago in September 1991, being sponsored through university by British Rail on its engineering management trainee scheme. The scheme involved a wide variety of placements around the industry, either side of my degree in electrical and electronic engineering at Imperial, and led directly to a role with ScotRail at the end of the programme. I remained with ScotRail for around 7 years, firstly in the technical offices at Inverness and then at Shields Depot in Glasgow, before returning to Inverness as a production manager, working around the shifts and learning about the real world of running a railway, ensuring there's enough trains for the start of service each day, as well as learning at the sharp end about team management and industrial relations, experiences that have served me well throughout my career. So in 2002, I joined Angel Trains as a fleet engineer for what I thought would be a 2 or 3 year stint down south. Over the last 18 years, I've held 6 jobs at Angel, spending the last 10 years on the senior management team as head of projects, then head of fleet, and leading to where I am now as head of product management. And in this role, I'm responsible for the long-term development of Angel Trains' existing assets, ensuring they're attractive to both current and potential future customers. Angel Trains was formed, as Felix said, as one of 3 rolling stock leasing companies that were set up at privatisation, and we're now one of the biggest private investors in Britain's railways, having invested over £5 billion in new trains and refurbishment since 1994. We own a broad portfolio of fleets at all stages of asset life, from HSTs that have recently been refurbished and delivered to ScotRail, mid-life fleets such as Pendolinos on West Coast and Desiro Classics on several routes, and right through to the recently delivered Hitachi Class 802s and Bombardier Aventras that are currently being delivered into Greater Anglia. And as we complete the delivery of the 665 vehicle Aventra fleet, Angel will own around 5,000 vehicles and will have a market share of around 24%. So, moving on to the challenges. Before the pandemic, Britain's railways were already facing a number of challenges. The impending structural change to the passenger rail industry that is expected to be brought about by the recommendations contained in the Williams Review, which was expected to signal the end of franchising and the transition arrangements to new rail contracts. Decarbonisation and the requirement to remove diesel-only passenger trains from the network by 2040, earlier in Scotland, means that alternative traction energy sources will be required. And digital transformation, the need to make better use of data, turning it into useful, actionable information to improve efficiency and ultimately to provide better services. And then the COVID pandemic landed on our shores. And over and above these existing challenges, which remain relevant, COVID-19 and the effects of repeated lockdowns have seriously impacted the whole industry, adding a whole new set of challenges and adding a degree of complexity to the challenges that we were already facing. So for each of these challenges in turn, I'm going to give you a rolling stock asset manager's view of what we're doing and what still needs to be done to address those challenges. So starting with playing our part in the COVID-19 response, it's impossible to overstate the impact that COVID has had on our industry. And against a backdrop of the biggest peacetime fiscal deficit that our country's ever had, the drop in passenger numbers means that ticket revenue has fallen off a cliff, meaning that our railways are currently being subsidised to the tune of over £700 million a month. Now, this is clearly not sustainable, and experts are predicting that it will be years, not months, before passengers return to pre-COVID levels, and that the traditional Monday to Friday commute might be a thing of the past, as both individuals and businesses have proved that many can adapt to remote working. So supporting our customers is therefore of paramount importance, particularly in getting passengers back onto trains. So what have we been doing to help in this regard? Well, one of the biggest barriers to public confidence in getting back onto trains is concern about being able to socially distance whilst on board. And one way of addressing that is being able to provide up-to-date information about which trains are busy and which are quieter. So for example, on South Eastern, we've developed a relatively simple passenger load estimation system that can be easily retrofitted to the network or fleet and provides reasonably accurate estimate of the number of people on the train. And that allows South Eastern to feed its app and its website with up-to-date loading information, allowing customers to choose to travel on less busy services. Thinking more broadly, we developed a virtual reality app which simulated a passenger's journey, highlighting the antiviral measures that had been implemented on trains and in stations, and allowed people to test run before embarking on a real journey. Now, although this hasn't been taken up in its original purpose, the core app has been adapted and is being used by one of our customers to provide accessibility awareness training to its staff. And we've developed a number of smaller ideas, such as bottle holders to allow hand sanitizer to be installed at strategic points in a train, and excluded seating indicators to promote social distancing on board, with 3D printing technology utilised to allow rapid design prototyping and rollout if required. And finally, in this area, we've also been developing surface coatings that may have antiviral properties, which might have benefits in the longer run against transmission of seasonal flu as well as COVID. Now, throughout the pandemic, we've recognised that a number of our suppliers have struggled, with some of them impacted by contracts from other industries being suspended or cancelled, and their ability to complete work often compromised by staff sickness as people have to self-isolate. Now, Angel Trains, if we recognise that if we want our strategic suppliers to be there for us tomorrow, then we need to be here for them today. And we therefore took the decision to continue with maintenance and overhaul programmes as planned, and to give our supply chain some surety of workload. We've also ensured that we honour our payment terms, and in some cases we've accelerated payments to help suppliers with short-term cash flow difficulties. And since the start of the first lockdown, we've delivered, to give you an idea of the quantities, we've delivered some 250 classified repairs, 140 engine changes and 110 transmission changes. And in that time, we've spent over £100 million on new trains, with the last deliveries of the Hitachi Class 802s and the first deliveries of the Bombardier Aventras with Greater Anglia, with significantly more to come on the Aventra project. We've spent over £70 million on refurbishments, modifications and enhancement projects, including the HSTs for Abellio ScotRail, and we've spent over £30 million on the aforementioned heavy maintenance programmes. So we're certainly trying to play our part in supporting the supply chain and keeping the wheels of our industry turning. We've also supported and led industry initiatives through the COVID-19 working group, with the aim of understanding how the virus might propagate through a rail vehicle, leading to better understanding of potential transmission mechanisms, in turn allowing more effective mitigating measures to be developed and implemented. So Angel Trains is leading computational fluid dynamic work to predict airflows around vehicle interiors, and working with a new supplier, Norton Straw, to deliver models for a range of vehicle types, and sharing the results with industry and with wider transport research programmes. And we've also supported our colleagues at First Group through making trains available for real-world testing to be carried out with smoke bombs and lasers, to compare and contrast what actually happens against the CFD models and validating the accuracy of these models. So in combination, these work streams are important as they allow us to predict the airflow around the inside of a train. And whilst predicting airflow doesn't measure the viral load in the train, it does help us to predict the risk areas if someone suffering from COVID were to travel on that train. So in particular, this work identifies surfaces that are exposed to higher airflows and hence higher potential viral loading. And that allows cleaning regimes to be focused and intensified in these areas. We also have a number of suppliers that are promoting improved air conditioning filters with the aim of reducing the number of virus particles suspended in the air inside a train. And we're supporting trials of these to verify scientifically the effectiveness of the filters, and also to assess the overall impact on the performance of the air conditioning itself. So these results can potentially be overlaid with airflow modelling to truly understand the impact of proposed changes on the air quality and the potential viral load inside the train. Now, this work is essential because as lockdown eventually eases and life begins to return to normal, we need to be able to reassure the public that travelling by train is as safe as it can be. So through these three areas, supporting our customers, supporting our existing supply base and new suppliers, and supporting industry collaboration, we've been trying to play our part in the industry's COVID response. Now, since Theresa May, I think being strong and stable has lost its appeal, but in this scenario, I think there is something to be said for the stability and the flexibility that we've offered in these difficult times. There's still clearly much to do, but ultimately we need to get passengers back onto trains. Moving on now to the impending changes to the structure of the passenger railway. Pre-COVID, the general expectation was that the Williams Review would signal a move away from franchising as we knew it and towards another form of passenger service delivery, possibly based on concessions. And the catalyst of COVID-19 has accelerated this change through the various types of contract. So since last year, we've already moved from franchises to emergency measures agreements, to emergency recovery measures agreements, and we know that still to come, we've got the transition from ERMAs to direct awards and then finally into new rail contracts. Now, by the end of this, some operators will have had 5 different contracts in around 2 years. And as a leasing company, we can't escape the fact that we were set up to service the franchise market, and that market is not going to exist in future. So it is certain that we will need to adapt to the new structure as it emerges. And as we move towards these new rail contracts, there's a high concentration of change between now and 2023. And this intense period of releasing will bring challenges across the whole industry. Now, although some of the recommendations, the possible recommendations from Williams have been widely trailed, there's still an element of uncertainty around the nature of new rail contracts, who the customer will be, and who will be the controlling mind, with the jungle drums currently seeming to suggest that this will sit within Network Rail, although devolution to regional or metropolitan transport authorities has also been suggested. So we know that change is coming, and we're doing our best to anticipate what that change might bring. But until we know for sure, it is challenging to fully prepare for the change. However, with the taxpayer funding the railway to the extent that it is, we are confident that there will be a focus on value for money with a high level of scrutiny of ongoing costs and opportunities to make savings, and performance improvement, both in reliability and in the onboard services provided to passengers. And for me, the critical issue here is not looking at problems from a single organisation's perspective, but identifying the challenges at a system level and identifying system level solutions and working the business case back from there. As an industry, if we're going to provide value for money, we need to get better at working through the contractual complexities and building the link from where the cost sits to where the benefit can potentially be realised. Now, digitisation has been an industry objective for a few years now, and I think that the value for money and performance challenges that we now face give a real sense of purpose to driving this digital transformation forward. So through effective digital transformation, I believe that we can go some way to addressing both the value for money and performance improvement themes that we expect to be enshrined into the new rail contracts. And through the following examples, I'll try to identify where better use of technology and data can achieve cost reduction or performance improvement. So firstly, automatic inspection systems are now in place at a number of depots across the country, and with more coming online in conjunction with new train introductions. These can allow better maintenance efficiency, with lengthy manual inspections avoided and only necessary maintenance being carried out, and also material scheduling being automated based on the results of the inspections. Taken further, this has the potential to support true condition-based maintenance, which could bring big savings across the industry if trains don't need to return to depots as often, saving on both maintenance time and the time and cost of making empty coaching stock moves. Opportunities for performance improvement. And the example that I use here is a very simple engine monitoring system. And sometimes, as in this case, condition monitoring doesn't improve the component reliability, but it can improve the overall system performance. So in this case, the right alert at the right time from a Class 156 engine monitor identified an emerging fault condition that would have led to engine failure through comparison between what was happening on the two vehicles of a unit. The set was able to be swapped out and no in-service failure occurred. So yes, the set still needed to go to the depot for repair, but no delay was incurred, meaning no Schedule 8 payments to Network Rail, no delay repay, and no disgruntled and inconvenienced passengers. And as this type of monitoring increases, the knowledge base also increases. And it's possible that through machine learning, we can identify precursor or trigger conditions and automatically identify emerging fault conditions in future. I've mentioned earlier the passenger estimation system that we developed for Southeastern and how this supported the provision of passenger loadings to inform travel choices. Now, as we try to tempt passengers back onto the railway, we need to consider how we can provide better end-to-end information, and moving beyond the traditional displays of destination and next station, giving passengers up-to-date, relevant information, such as service updates at interchanges. This is all possible, and it will help to improve the overall journey experience. And monitoring of infrastructure through service trains is a great example of where we can take a system-level approach. So my example here is a pantograph accelerometer fitted to one of our West Midlands Class 350s. The pilot unit registered a high impact in service, and the alert allowed Network Rail to accurately and quickly locate where the issue occurred and arrange an inspection. This identified an issue with the overhead before a dewirement occurred, saving potentially thousands of minutes of delay and associated costs. Now, this type of system, with a reasonable proportion of vehicles fitted on a route, the information gathered has the potential to prevent a significant proportion of overhead line problems before they cause in-service incidents. So I think the possibilities for this type of monitoring are almost endless. And there are some obvious other possibilities, such as track geometry and vegetation management, where frequent measurement through service trains can provide a real overall benefit to the industry. The final challenge that I'm going to discuss today is decarbonisation, and thinking first about the drivers for decarbonisation. Why is it important to us? Well, back in early 2018, the then Rail Minister, Joe Johnson, issued a challenge to remove all diesel-only trains from the network by 2040. The subsequent industry task force report concluded that the no diesel only by 2040 target was achievable for passenger trains, but recognised that decarbonising freight presented a different set of challenges. The task force also noted that compliance with the government's stated target, which is now enshrined in law, of Britain producing net zero carbon emissions by 2050, was also challenging but achievable for passenger rail. Perhaps of more significance even than legislation, however, is the increasing pressure that comes from the weight of public opinion. And in a world where people are generally becoming more aware of our impact on our planet and our environment, in a world where diesel bans in urban areas and emissions charging are becoming increasingly commonplace for road vehicles, awareness of emissions from diesel trains is also increasing. So, although rail is responsible for only 2% of the CO2 output for all of Britain's land transport and represents less than half of 1% of Britain's overall CO2 output, we can't afford to rest on our laurels. We've seen massive developments in electric cars. There are hybrid and hydrogen buses on the streets. So we in the rail industry need to work hard to retain our environmental advantage against other modes of transport. So as an industry, how are we addressing the decarbonisation challenge? Well, alongside the Decarbonisation Task Force's report, we now have the Rail Technical Strategy with its decarbonisation theme, and we've got Network Rail's Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, or TDNS, which identifies that if we're going to achieve our decarbonisation targets, we need to electrify 11,700 single track kilometres of railway, use battery traction on around 400 kilometres of railway, and that hydrogen is the preferred choice in the longer term for around 900 kilometres of railway. And that leaves just over 2,000 kilometres where more than one of the available options could provide a viable solution. Now, the infrastructure to support this will clearly take some time to deliver. Around 12,000 kilometres of electrification infrastructure and almost 1,000 kilometres of hydrogen infrastructure won't appear overnight. And that volume of electrification is likely to take around 30 years to deliver. TDNS also recognises that interim or bridging technologies will be required if we're going to make progress towards our decarbonisation objectives whilst this infrastructure is built. So moving on to consider some of the traction options that will be required to achieve our decarbonisation targets, and thinking first about the long-term solutions. So as recognised by the task force and TDNS, electrification must be part of the mix when thinking about decarbonisation. It's currently the only effective way to move heavy loads or to move at high speed. Now, of course, we've got to recognise that the whole industry had our collective fingers burned with the time and cost overruns of recent electrification programmes, but this shouldn't detract from the fact that electrification of highly used, higher speed routes is the most effective and cost-effective way of decarbonising the railway. And we should also recognise the sterling work done by RIA and others in identifying how electrification can be done more effectively and more efficiently in future. Electrification is never going to be an overnight solution, especially if we want to grow and retain the skills through a managed rolling programme rather than the boom and bust approach often employed in the past. But I think it's encouraging that Transport Scotland has committed to a rolling programme of electrification of its major routes, and I hope that this approach catches on south of Hadrian's Wall as well. Now, at the other end of the power spectrum, we've got battery-only traction, and battery-only trains are currently constrained to shortish, self-contained branch lines. Now, as battery power density and charging technology improve in future, it's likely that this range will increase in the medium term. However, batteries on their own are unlikely to provide a viable solution over longer distances or at high speed. And then in the middle, we've got hydrogen fuel cells. Now, hydrogen's politically very popular and gives us zero emissions at the point of use, But we have to remember that even where we are in hydrogen's window of opportunity on relatively lightly used but longer routes, there are some operational limitations, including range. So hydrogen trains are likely to have an effective range of around 600 miles between refuelling events, as opposed to around 1,600 miles for a conventional diesel. Now, more frequent refuelling means refuelling stops during the day, more refuelling points, additional staff, and possibly also additional trains. And we also need to recognise that the necessary infrastructure to generate, store, and distribute hydrogen as a fuel source for mass transit doesn't yet exist in Britain. Now, if supported by joined-up government policies on energy, industrial strategy, and transport, then renewable energy can be used to produce green hydrogen during periods of low grid demand, which is then stored locally and used either to power transport or to convert back to electricity when demand's higher. And an example of this joined-up approach can be seen in Germany, where Alstom's Island is powered from locally produced hydrogen. And Transport Scotland has recently set out its vision to use renewable energy to produce hydrogen to power trains on its less densely used long-distance routes, such as West Highland and Far North lines from Inverness. Moving on to the bridging technologies, we have bimode trains, which can be either diesel-electric bimodes or battery-electric bimodes. And these types of train have the advantage of using electric infrastructure where it exists, switching to the independent power source, the diesel engine or the battery, where required. And this can eradicate the problem of running diesel trains under the wires because of potentially only one section of non-electrified track along the route. However, bimode trains aren't optimal, and as you're carrying around two traction energy sources, only one of which is ever in use at a time, meaning that you're always carrying around the dead weight of the other. Battery electric bimodes use a battery to power the train through gaps in electrification infrastructure, and this could potentially lower electrification costs in future by avoiding the need to electrify complex or difficult areas. And this was shown to be feasible by the IPEMU trial a few years ago, and it would also allow last mile type situations such as Oxenholme to Windermere to run as through services from Manchester, served by battery electric bimodes. Now, if we need to go beyond the range of the battery alone and to cover all of the non-electrified route miles that are currently operated by diesels, then there are other bridging technologies available, and some of the options include hybrid drives, gas engines, and steam turbines, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. Thinking about the available independent power traction energy options that might contribute to the decarbonisation effort. This chart is taken from the RSSB research project into decarbonisation of traction energy and shows the relative well-to-wheel CO2 outputs for various traction types. So there's a few key points that I'd like to highlight here. Firstly, that while hydrogen certainly gives zero emissions at the point of use, it's important to recognise if we use brown hydrogen with today's grid mix of electricity, we can end up with overall emissions that are not much better than diesel. Where we get the real dip benefit is where we're using green hydrogen produced from renewable energy. Secondly, by hybridising existing fleets, there is a potential to save around between a quarter and a third of the emissions that are currently produced by diesel trains. And thirdly, that gas engines can also provide a step change in CO2 emissions if retrofitted in place of diesel engines. So, whilst widespread electrification is desirable, it's not an overnight solution. And whilst hydrogen might provide a long-term answer on non-electrified lines, there are some operational constraints, and the infrastructure to support it in regular service isn't yet in place. So as an industry, we could wait. We could wait for the infrastructure to be built and then build or modify the rolling stock to take advantage of it. or we can be bold and take steps now in the right direction to start making a positive difference to our environment today without cutting off progress towards those longer-term goals. And this latter approach would mean that the railway industry can work steadily towards its decarbonisation targets using bridging technologies to ensure that emissions are significantly reduced from current levels in advance of the long-term solutions being implemented. And my clear view is that as an industry, we should be starting to take steps on the decarbonisation journey now by applying some of those bridging technologies. So the first of those bridging technologies that I'm going to talk about is hybridisation. And although it's complex, it can be retrofitted to existing diesel fleets. And what we see here is a representation of a series hybrid, such as the one that we're piloting on our Class 165 unit with Chiltern Railways, with batteries driving a traction motor and a pair of diesel generators keeping the batteries charged. And although this would still involve a diesel engine, at least in the early days, hybridisation is immediately available with no additional infrastructure required. So anywhere a diesel train can go today, a hybrid can go tomorrow. It would also give significant overall reductions in CO2 emissions, with the potential for zero emissions in stations through running on the battery alone. And if well designed, it also gives a clear upgrade path to lower carbon fuels in future, because the diesel generators could be replaced with something else, a gas generator or other options. Secondly, there are gas engines, and these are commonplace on road transport, but haven't yet made the transition to rail. Now, I don't believe there are any ready-made solutions out there that fit in the space envelope that we would need to fit under a DMU that can give the necessary power and torque. However, what you see here is an existing Cummins NT855 engine, widely used on BR-era DMUs, which has been converted to run on LPG and is currently on the test bed at our supplier. And whilst this would still be burning a fossil fuel, as I showed earlier, it would still bring about a significant drop in CO2 and other emissions. And finally, here we've got a hydrogen steam turbine, so a potential alternative to a fuel cell. And this can be used either as a generator to power an electric drive line or as a direct drive through a transmission to repower an existing diesel unit. And although this one is less advanced than the other alternatives identified here, it could be one of the potential upgrade paths for hybrid drives in future. So, in bringing this talk towards a conclusion, the industry is suffering through the effects of the pandemic and the lack of passengers. The current level of government support to the industry is not sustainable in the long term, and to change that, we need to get passengers out of their cars and back onto trains. So when the time is right, we need to change the message from "don't take the train" to "it's safe and it's green to take the train." The challenges that the industry faces are real, and I appreciate that I've merely scratched the surface in the time that I've had with you today. So I'd like to leave you with three main thoughts. Firstly, we understand the industry is suffering at present, particularly through the lack of passengers and the resultant financial impact. We're trying to do our bit by supporting our customers through these extremely challenging times and supporting the supply chain to ensure that we all come out the other side. Ultimately, we need to work together to provide a safe and dependable service to encourage passengers back onto our trains. Secondly, change is coming to the industry through the Williams Review, and to borrow a phrase used by many politicians recently, the industry will need to embrace the changes and to build back better. Digitisation and the benefits that it can bring to operating efficiency and passenger information can be a strong contributor to building back better and enticing passengers back onto the railway. And finally, sustainability, and within that, decarbonisation is here and it's here to stay. And we're investing in different approaches to address this. As a supply chain, we need to ensure that we focus not just on the long-term solutions of electrification, batteries and hydrogen, where the infrastructure required takes time to put in place, but also in developing cost-effective bridging technologies that can be implemented quickly and which will be required to take steps towards our decarbonisation goals. So thank you all for your time and attention today. Before we move on to questions, I am going to do one little sales pitch. It's not a sales pitch for Angel Trains. It's a sales pitch for the IMechE Railway Division annual luncheon, which will be held on Friday the 5th of March from 11:30 till 3 o'clock. It's the first time it's been held virtually, so lots of logistic challenges in setting this up, but we really would appreciate everyone's attendance, and there will be lots of opportunities to network and make contact. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ewan. A very, very good use of the 40 minutes you had for this talk. You've really gone quite deep into the subject matter and into looking at the future of our railway from a rolling stock perspective. I've had some questions which I was going to sequence in a way. We'll start with the easiest ones and then we go on to the more difficult ones. I think, is that okay with you, Ewan?
That's fine, Felix.
So I think Alex Powell asked whether the Williams Review had been published in full.
Sorry, Felix, you broke up a little there.
Alex Powell asked whether the Williams Review had been published in full. I think it's not been published in full.
No, it's the Williams Review hasn't been published yet. I think it's been imminent for quite a while now, but I think there seems to be a consensus that it is now imminent, and that we're some of the recommendations have been quite widely trailed. So I think it would be a real surprise if we didn't move towards some sort of concession-based model for passenger operations in future, and that there will be a controlling mind somewhere, possibly within Network Rail.
Okay, thank you. The second question is from George Felton of the Isle of Wight Railway Company Limited. I think that's probably the Isle of Wight Steam Railway. But he's asking that hybridization will, of course, involve investment in the existing fleets, and investing in existing fleets will require the production of CO2 or creation of CO2 as part of the conversion process. Is that being taken into account in assessing whether it's worth doing or not?
I think what we try to do is assess the overall CO2 impact. And yes, there is CO2 produced in the conversion process, and we do recognise that. However, that is a small proportion of the CO2 that would be produced from building a new train. And if it's the opportunity of an incremental change towards hybridization or building a new train, if the original train isn't life expired, then I think in most cases the equation will come down on the side of the incremental change. But it's a very good question, and it is something that has to be considered as part of the evaluation.
So what sort of remaining life do you look for in a train before you decide to do a hybridization?
I think it's each case on its individual merits, Felix. I think if we had something that had a couple of years left, then we probably wouldn't be hybridizing it. We'd look at other options, possibly exhaust after treatments. That doesn't help with decarbonisation, but it does help with air quality. But if you're getting towards sort of 8, 9, 10 years, then I think there's a case to do something. And as with everything, there's shades of grey in between. There's never a clear-cut answer.
Okay, thank you. There's the other question from George is about the customer environment quality of new trains. He feels that quite a lot of new train orders have resulted in uncomfortable seating and not necessarily the best views from the windows because the need to optimize use of space. Is that going to change with the trying to attract passengers to rail?
I think the first thing it would be important to acknowledge there is that, from George's question, yes, there have been a lot of complaints about this. A lot of new train orders have been developed on very clear seat numbers that have to be on the train, and maybe in future, if the specification from the controlling mind, wherever that ends up sitting, if the specification is a bit more flexible and allows people that are going to be running the services to choose, that there will be a better evaluation of seat comfort versus seat numbers.
Okay, I think associated with that is a question of Doug Holden, who says with the drive to more active travel, which should involve more use of people's feet, but also more use of bicycles, whether there's sort of a likelihood that we will provide more bicycle spaces on trains. My view is fairly clear on that one.
Yeah, and like you, Felix, I've recently invested in a Brompton, so I think when we get back to commuting, that will form part of my journey as well. This isn't one that I can take credit for, but I know that our colleagues at ScotRail have recently implemented a conversion of some carriages specifically to facilitate more cycling spaces on their tourist routes, particularly on the West Highland line. I think that's a really good idea, and it'll be really interesting to see what the success of that is. But yes, if we're thinking about end-to-end journeys and we're trying to think about rail as part of an integrated journey, then making provision for the other legs of those journeys is something we do need to be thinking about.
Well, personally, I think to carry full-size bicycles on commuter trains is not ecologically a sound proposition because bicycles take up a significant amount of space. They also extend dwell times if they are loaded in a special place. So it's not an ideal solution. I think folding bicycles or very good cycle facilities at stations, such as we see in Holland, are a much better option. In Holland, bicycles can get serviced during the day and you basically get back a new bicycle in the evening, or more availability of higher bicycles of good quality. Andrew Cluth asks about the reassuring the public, the travelling public, to be reassured that rail travel is safe as it can be. Well, would this panel say a little more about this, particularly in regard to whether they see there is an absolute threshold level of safety for rail travel in isolation, as well as what they see needs to be done in comparison with other transport modes? From my perspective, I think you need to look at two aspects. One is the safety of the mode of transport in terms of accidents, injuries, etc., and the COVID safety. If you transfer traffic, and that has been shown in the past, to road traffic, you end up increasing the number of pedestrian deaths, the number of dead children, And we haven't got the new statistics yet for 2020, but if I look at today's traffic, it looks extremely worrying. What's your view on this?
I think you make very good points there, Felix, and I think Andrew's question is it is a challenging one, and I think it's very difficult to answer fully in isolation. There are some industry level research projects going on. RSSB has led a lot of research in this area, but even beyond that, there are wider programs that are managed through the DFT. So I think it's a wide question, but what we do need to do is make sure that if we can make something, if we can make it better, we make it better, and just make sure that the measures that we are taking are effective. I mentioned about air conditioning filters. Quite early on in this, there were people saying, let's just change the filters for a finer grade of filter, and that will make things better. I think what we're doing now is taking a joined-up approach to that, to actually understand how air and virus aerosols contained in that air are flowing around train vehicles, and understanding what the effect of the measures that we're implementing will be. Because if it's not going to make a difference, or if it stops the air conditioning working because the filter clogs up, then that probably isn't the right thing to do, because what we have seen from all of this is that movement of air, and particularly introduction of fresh air, is one of the main mitigants against transmission of COVID. I think the final thing I'd say on this is, whilst it's absolutely not a reason to be complacent, I don't believe from all the research that's been done that there has been a super spreader event identified on a train. So with the measures that we are taking, albeit with very low passenger numbers, I think we just have to keep moving in the right direction.
And I think the experience from other countries where traffic has held up at levels like 50, 60, 70% of normal levels has also not shown super spreader events on public transport. So I think people have to be very aware of these numbers before they make decisions about which mode to use. There's been another question from Andrew about the future, what the panel thinks about the future transport needs. I think the only point I would like to make is that it's fantastic to work from home if you have got sufficient space, if you have got a supportive environment. It's not possible if you live in a multi-generational household with limited space. You really want to go to work because that's what makes life workable.
Well, and picking up on that theme, Felix, with 3 children of 9 and under in the house, I'm actually surprised we've not had a guest appearance from any of them during this presentation. But listen, I think that there are lots of people, lots of organisations making predictions about demand, and I think it does seem to be, the consensus seems to be it's going to be a long, slow trajectory of recovery, and actually that we might see a recovery in the leisure travel market ahead of the commuter travel market.
Thank you. Kin Young Chung has asked about the potential of using wireless sensors in the Internet of Things to achieve predictive maintenance or improve passenger experience. Are there some real-life experience of using IoT sensors inside vehicles?
This is something that we have looked at. I don't think we've done it on a train in service. We have done it on trains in storage to try things out. So one for the future, but not one that's there yet.
Okay, I think Mike Corbett phrases his question about moving forward with the industry supply chain as a COVID question, but it's not really a COVID question at all. It's about how do we get the introduction of new trains with software and hardware better with better performance, better reliability, and a much more reliable and fast development process?
Well, thanks, Mike, for that question. Yeah, that's a challenge. And new train introduction's always been a challenge, but where it was mechanical components that were known and understood, it was easier to manage any teething troubles. You rightly say that software has had a big impact on recent train introductions, and I think the best answer I can give today is that we try and learn from the experiences of the problems that have been faced on recent introductions. I think the other thing that I would say is, my initial take on that back with suppliers would be, let's try and go for incremental change rather than revolutionary change in future. We've had these problems this time. We will work through them. We will get to a stable system, a stable level of software. Let's build from that rather than starting from scratch next time.
And I think it's also a question, of course, about the longevity of both software and computer hardware, which is probably significantly shorter than a normal life of a train. So we will probably have to see multiple generations of software and computer hardware on trains while the rest stays. Is that a sensible assumption?
Yeah. Thanks, Felix.
Gerald wants to know whether Angel Trains and other fleet owners are likely to install more low-touch remote monitoring. So, for example, is there a strategy for bearing fitting with new monitoring systems?
I think with every system, I touched on in the presentation, there is a move towards condition monitoring, and if that can be implemented in such a way that it improves the reliability of the train or makes the maintenance regime more efficient, then that is something to be looked at.
I think the last question which we can answer is from Tim Stubbs about when is the anticipated timescale for the interior airflow tests becoming published?
Airflow tests have been ongoing. I showed some photographs of them. I showed some images from the CFD modelling. So it's not something that has an absolute end to it, unfortunately, Tim. It's incremental steps. We're getting to a stage now where we've got a better understanding for some fleet types, but these are feeding into, as I said, into wider research programs, both for the rail industry specifically and transport generally.
Okay. So I think that's probably it. I haven't seen any new questions coming up. So Ewan, I'd like to thank you hugely for an excellent presentation and for a very, very good set of answers to what I consider to be searching and useful questions. So thank you very much. And I'm sure the audience will agree that this was a very well spent lunchtime.
Well, thank you very much, Felix, and thanks everyone for your attention and participation in the questions.
Thank you, Natalie, for your support.